Hey, if you've been thinking about buying used gear but are a little unsure of the process due to the overwhelming amount of choices out there, stay tuned. I'm going to walk us through some of the different websites and apps so we know what to look for, what to stay away from, so we don't get ripped off and we end up with that guitar or amp of our dreams. Hands down, the biggest player in the game is going to be Reverb.com, and whether you're on the desktop site or on their mobile app, you'll definitely find a plethora of choices for pretty much whatever you're looking for in terms of used gear. Now, generally, you already have an idea of what you're looking for in terms of a brand of guitar or amp, but sometimes it's cool to just kind of browse. Like right now, I'm looking at the Player's Grade Vintage Guitar section, and you never know, you might stumble across something that you did not know that you needed, and sometimes you can actually find some bargains on some pretty good guitars or amps, like this 74 Strat here that's got a scalloped fretboard on it, which looks pretty cool if you're into that kind of thing. Now, definitely read the descriptions on any gear that you're potentially thinking about buying, because most of the time, if you're only going off pictures, you might find some kind of hidden surprise when you get the gear delivered to your house. So things I like to look at are there any repairs done to the instrument? What kind of modifications have been done to it? So obviously on this Stratocaster here, it's got a scalloped fingerboard, and that was not done by the factory. And just kind of looking at it, I don't like the way those scallops look. So I would probably stay away from this one. And then something else that catches my eye are all these holes that have been drilled into the peg head on this Strat. Now, one of them at the top there looks like it was probably the other string tree, but those others I'm not too sure about. Also, you want to keep in mind any kind of return policies that any of the sellers have. Most of the time they're bought as is, meaning that if you get the guitar and then all of a sudden you decide that you don't like it, well, that's not a good enough reason to return it. So definitely know what you're looking at and what you're purchasing before you hit the buy it now button. Now, if there's something where it's obviously shipped and you received it and it's not as advertised, well, then that's a case right there for a return. Right there it says this item is sold as described and cannot be returned unless it arrives in a condition other than how it was described or photographed. So kind of keep that in mind as you're making a purchase on used gear. Also, weigh your options on pricing. You might find two guitars that are very similar in what you're looking for that could have radically different prices. I've seen as much as $1,000 price swings on some of these vintage higher end guitars, so definitely do your research, shop around a little bit, and you don't necessarily need to be in such a hurry to hit the buy it now button. Same holds true for vintage amplifiers. So there's definitely a lot of amps available on Reverb.com. Just keep in mind though that a lot of the times sellers, when they're selling amplifiers, they don't always offer free shipping. Sometimes you might get lucky on some free shipping, but they've usually factored that shipping cost into the price they're wanting to get out of the amplifier, because amplifiers are bigger, bulkier, and heavier. The shipping cost is going to be reflected upon that. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at an amp or something and you're like, oh wow, I can afford this, but then when you find out the shipping is another $100 or $200 or sometimes more if it's coming from out of the country, then you kind of need to think about those things when you're factoring in your purchase cost. Another thing also to think about too is if you're buying an amplifier, a lot of vintage amplifiers have been modified. And I personally don't want an amp that's been modified because sometimes they're drilling unnecessary holes in the chassis of it, which is basically non-repairable. So certain modifications you can kind of get away with if they haven't drilled any extra holes in the amplifier. But just do your research first before you make a purchase on a vintage amplifier, because the last thing you want is an irreversible modification. So the cool thing about amps is most of the old ones, because it's just tubes and transistors, everything should be reversible on it if it was modified and you want to get it back to original factory specs. I love these old Marshall Super Lead Plexis, but a lot of the time They drill a hole in the back of the chassis to add a master volume to it, which kind of to me defaces the value of it. Now, years ago, before Reverb, eBay was the go-to site for used and vintage guitars and amplifiers. In fact, I've sold a lot of guitars as well as bought a lot of guitars on eBay. And occasionally I'll go on there and check, because I've noticed that a lot of people will list on eBay and not necessarily on Reverb. Sometimes you might see a listing that's on both sites simultaneously. And I know with a lot of overseas sellers, that will sell on eBay instead of Reverb. Now with Reverb, you've got the ability to pay with Affirm, which is kind of like a financing thing. So, and it's really too easy to purchase something and just make those monthly payments on it until you get it paid off. Whereas eBay, they don't have it quite that easy. You need to apply for PayPal credit and all that stuff. So I notice a lot of overseas sellers, though, they don't accept Affirm. So you're kind of stuck with paying for it outright or busting your credit card out to make some of those purchases. You know, the same rules apply on eBay as any other site. Is make sure you're reading descriptions. Also check the seller's feedback history. You definitely want to stick with sellers that have done a lot of transactions and have a really high feedback percentage. Most of the time, though, most of the sellers will have a very good feedback rating. And also, it used to be years ago that the seller had all the protection, meaning the companies like eBay or Reverb would give more preferential treatment to the seller than the buyer. But now that has switched to where the buyer gets all of the rights as opposed to more of the seller getting more rights and liberties with the transaction. So feel confident in your purchase that if something is just not right and it's clearly a blatant error on the seller's part, eBay or Reverb will do everything that they can to make the transaction right. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any questions about anything that I covered today, feel free to drop those comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe to Joe's Fancy Guitar Studio. Turn on those bell notifications so you see when the latest video is uploaded. And check out this video right here. Until next time, I'll see you guys later and keep rocking on.